Okay, so this is the specification from the part of theme 3, which is government intervention around markets. So it talks about to control mergers. So you've got the Competition and Market Authority in the UK, you've got the American antitrust investigations in America, or the EU Competition Commission. In terms of controlling mergers, it's the assessment of whether the market share is significant. So looking at it from a monopoly point of view, or a 4-firm concentration ratio over 40% or a 5-firm over 50%, and then they may block the merger from going ahead, or they may put in some regulations. And then it talks about controlling monopolies. So you've got price regulation, maximum prices, things like rail fares would be an example of that. You've got profit regulation, so normally as a percentage of turnover, which then might lead to things like windfall taxes if the profits are too large. You've got quality standards, so to provide a specific quality, and you've got performance targets, and again the train companies in terms of hitting their times at stations, they have quality and performance targets to meet there. So the government could allow a monopoly, but they might regulate it to maintain benefits to consumers, and the price regulation is linked into allocative efficiency, quality standards, dynamic efficiency, performance, allocative efficiency. Profit regulation might be linked into dynamic efficiency or productive efficiency as well. Government intervention to promote competition and contestability, enhancing competitions through promotion of small businesses, so that could be with subsidies or kind of lower taxes for those businesses. Deregulation will reduce the cost of production for businesses, so reducing barriers to entry as well for firms entering markets. Competitive tendering for government contracts, so allowing multiple businesses to bid, or potentially privatisation. One of the most significant recently was the Royal Mail, and when that was privatised, it increased or reduced the barriers to entry into delivery. Government intervention to protect suppliers, so restrictions of monopoly power of firms, or potentially nationalisation. So you could look at some of Labour's policies are talking about renationalising the railways, potentially because they're making too much abnormal profit in the private sector. Just to give a few examples of the different regulators, so one of the most heard about ones at the moment is Ofgem, which is looking at kind of gas and electricity, and several of the main parties are looking at putting price caps or maximum prices on energy. The Office for Rail and Road, those are the ones that regulate the rail, and you've got several other, water there as well. The impacts of government intervention, you can draw on some of the monopoly graphs. So if you had a maximum price, you'd probably set that at allocative efficiency, where marginal cost equals average revenue. And you could also analyse the same in terms of profit. So if the monopoly was at the profit maximising point, setting it at allocative efficiency would reduce that level of profit for the business. So you could regulate the quantity or the price to achieve allocative efficiency, and that would reduce the price, increase the quantity, reduce the profit. You would gain in terms of allocative efficiency. The market would be more productively efficient, or it would be operating at a lower average cost than it would be at profit maximising. And again, you can talk about regulating quality and choice. The two key limits to government intervention they have here are regulatory capture, so that businesses will put pressure on the regulators to maybe not set the price too low or not set the quality standards too high, so it's not socially optimum. And asymmetric information is linked into a government failure, and that the government might not actually know what the allocative efficient output is. They may not know what the costs are for a business, so in terms of subsidies and other things like that, they might subsidise at the wrong amount, and again it doesn't lead to a socio-optimum allocation of resources. The other parts that I thought might come up, which we may not have gone through in enough detail, were around the diminishing marginal productivity. We did a little bit about this the other week, but the relationship between short and long run average cost. So that the diminishing marginal productivity was kind of how the cost curves, so the marginal product is the same as, or kind of linked in closely to the marginal cost. So the diminishing marginal productivity is the reason that the marginal cost dips before it rises again. It's not a very accurate diagram I've drawn there, but they kind of they do line up. The relationship between short and long run average costs I'll come back to in a second, and also those kind of short run and long run shutdown points and the diagrammatic analysis of those. Okay, so in terms of short run average costs, this does link into diminishing marginal productivity or diminishing returns, and this is because one of the factors of production, and that's capital, is fixed in the short term. So in this example of the graph here, you've got average total cost in the short run with a small factory. So you can't change the size of the factory, but you can utilize the workers. So you've got short run average costs falling before they rise again, and the bottom part on all the cost curves is kind of linked to the long run average cost. So this red line is the long run average cost. Then you can move to a larger factory in the longer term. So again, you've got a new average cost, and then in the very long term you can go into a much larger factory. So in the long run, all factors of production can change, and that means that you've got the ability to keep increasing. Now, the economies of scale and diseconomies of scale are long run, are linked to the long run average cost curve. So the short run, it's about diminishing returns. So when the costs start to rise again, that's the diminishing marginal productivity. In the long run, the rising average cost is due to diseconomies of scale. So it's a really little key distinction to make. What you can see with this graph and what kind of happens in reality is between this point here and this point here is what we call constant returns to scale, or sometimes it's kind of a constant average cost. So sometimes constant refers to scales or constant average cost. This part here where it gets to that level is called the minimum efficient scale. So that quantity there is the minimum efficient scale, and what that is the kind of the costs at which you become competitive in the market. So this level of costs, or this scale of a business, is what you need to stay in the market in the long term. Anything below that, you're probably going to be making a loss until you can get your costs down to be able to compete in the market. Okay, the other thing that was on there is shutdown points. Now, there's a short-term shutdown point and there's a long-term shutdown point. In the long term, it's where the average total costs equal average revenue, or where AC equals AR. So at that point, you're making a long-term loss on all of your costs. And at that point, as a business, you'd go out of business. So there's a shutdown point in terms of survival over here, and there's a shutdown point in terms of you should only really go to normal profits on either side in the long term, for you to shut down, and that's true of all the market structures. In the short term, however, as your fixed costs have to be paid, you kind of forget those. So you forget your fixed costs and you just look at the variable costs. So it's when variable costs equals average revenue that you shut down. Now the variable cost curve will just be another curve below the average total cost. It's easier to draw these if you just use a diagram that's showing a loss. So a perfectly competitive firm showing a loss, or a monopoly showing a loss. So you can see in that monopoly the average total cost is greater than the average revenue, so there's a monopoly making a loss there. And in this diagram of perfect competition, again, average total cost is above average revenue, so again it's making a loss. So if you add on another line and you put that as average total cost, or average variable cost, average variable cost, then the point at which average variable cost equals average revenue becomes your shutdown. So the point at which you are currently not covering your average costs. And on this graph over here, again, you've got two shutdown points where average revenue equals variable cost. And if you can't remember the diagrams in the exam, if you just remember those two formulas, so long-term shutdown, average cost equals average revenue, short-term shutdown, variable cost equals average revenue, you can talk about that rather than draw the diagrams.